Because I still remember in the early days, so when we're in the early 1990s, we had 1,500 farmers or people come to a field day. Now, that is unheard of, to have that many people and all to look at, all the new crops the cropping group were growing, how they were being managed, fertilizer trials, herbicide trials, and we kept nothing a secret. I mean, everything that was done was discussed, and if it worked, well and good. If it didn't work, well, that's worth knowing too.
Welcome to the Profitable Farmer podcast, where we share stories and tips to help you run a better farming business and create your very own freedom farm. If you're looking to work smarter and not harder in your farm business, welcome. You're in the right place. Farming systems or grower groups form a pivotal part of the Australian landscape, bringing in-season leading research, trials and advancement about crop and pasture production for hundreds or thousands of farming families across Australia. For me, the pin-up or the pinnacle of those grower groups is Birchip Cropping Group. Farm Owners Academy is delighted to be partnering with leading grower groups across Australia to help bring our business education and coaching capability to these incredible institutions. In this interview, it gives me real pleasure to introduce to you Harm van Rees and to speak with Harm about the impact that Birchip Cropping Group and grower groups nationally have on our farming landscape. Harm van Rees has an incredible career, which I'll outline shortly, but has been part of the Birchip Cropping Group since its inception, with Ian McClelland and John Ferrier as founders 30 years ago. And today, Birchip Cropping Group is a team, I understand, of 26, providing incredible insights and support around production advancement to hundreds, if not thousands, of farming families across Australia. So I asked my father if he would explain his view on Harm van Rees as a great friend and colleague for over 30 years. And Dad's comment was, in summary, he's the farmer's champion and bridged the gap between farmers and the research community and could talk to all of them easily and effortlessly. He was not just a good bloke who set a high standard, but he cared deeply about farming families and all that he did. So Harm van Rees is an independent agronomist with a passion for science-based communication of improved grain production practices and systems. He initiated MAYCHECK, the Maximum Economic Yield Check program, in the late 1980s, which developed into Top Crop. And he was chair to Top Crop Victoria in the mid-90s. He worked with Birchip Cropping Group since its inception in 1992. Following a trip to Canada, instigated the herbicide and fungicide diagnostic schools and ran those initiatives across Victoria and Western Australia during the 90s and early 2000s. He introduced the AppSim-based simulation modelling via internet learning to Victorian farmers as a farm group activity in 2002. He worked with CSIRO in developing yield profit, an AppSim model for managing yield risk and nitrogen inputs. Farm Management 500 consultant to two groups, linking production to financial management and really pioneering with the Farm Management 500 group, bringing benchmarking and financial analysis of production performance into our industry. During the Millennium Drought, Harm worked in Papua New Guinea as head of agronomy to the PNG Oil Palm Research Association for 3 years, returning in 2009. Project leader for GRDC's National Paddock Survey 2014 to 2019, and using soil and plant testing data to better inform nutrient management. He received the GRDC Award for Excellence in 2020 and travelled to Europe, Canada and Argentina and met with farmers, agronomists and researchers in those countries to discuss the topic of the award, which was farming without glyphosate. To say Harm is a gentleman of our industry and to say that he made a significant contribution over the duration of his career would be an understatement. It gives me real pleasure to connect with Harm in this conversation, to share his story, but more importantly, I think, to celebrate the great work of Birchip Cropping Group. Harm, great to see you and thank you for your time. How are you?
Well, really good, Jeremy. So we're up in northern New South Wales at our holiday house and we've got beautiful weather and enjoying ourselves.
Perfect. It's great to connect again. My first question to you, Harm, is how does the Dutch son of Shell oil executive end up helping farming families at Birchip in northwestern Victoria?
Well, that's a pretty left field question. I actually like the question. So when I was 14, we as a family, and I've got 3 brothers, so with mum and dad, and as you said, Dad was working for Shell and being a Dutch company, had a job to do in Australia. And as I said, I was 14. My brothers are all younger than me. I did not speak a word of English. 2 days after arriving, I was at school, which was quite a experience, I must say. But I always thought that I was very lucky because I was treated exceptionally well, whereas some of the other immigrant kids, especially from Greece and Italy, they've struggled much more than I did. And I didn't speak a word of English. I think I said that. But after 2 or 3 weeks of the teacher saying, please read this book out aloud in front of the whole class, and I had to go in front of the class and read in a completely foreign questions with 38 or 40 kids rolling around in laughter. It doesn't take long to actually learn a language. And I survived. It might have been difficult times, but when I compared myself to the Greek and the Italian kids, I thought I was well off. And I made some very good friends who are still friends now. And that's the same with you guys. I'm sure you still know kids or people that you went to school with. And then Mum and Dad left again when I was 18. I was doing matriculation or sixth form back then. And I stayed behind to finish school. They then moved to Brazil and I wasn't super enthusiastic on following them there. So I went to university and the rest is history, really.
Did they come back to Australia from Brazil out of interest, Harm?
Yeah, after Brazil, Dad also worked in the UK, and then he came back again and he was the general manager for Woodside in Karratha. So setting up the whole refinery in Karratha. So Dad was the construction, the general manager of Woodside in Karratha. And they lived there for 3 or 4 years, I think. But that would have been when I was in my mid to late 20s, I think.
And Harm, what's your connection to agriculture? Do you have a link back to farming and agriculture in Holland, or did you stumble upon farming and agriculture when you landed in Australia?
Well, I did my undergraduate degree in science at Monash, and then I worked just doing odd jobs, but earned enough money to travel around the world, and I travelled for 3 years, primarily through Africa and South America. And because I was travelling overland, doing it the hard way, I met well, I was in a lot of country, village, small towns, and saw a lot of farming. And I became interested at that stage how third world farmers were actually producing their crops and also maintaining their livestock. And not to the extent that I really wanted to go and do ag, but it must have settled in my brain to develop that interest further, because when I came back to Australia, I did my PhD, my doctorate in agriculture at Melbourne Uni. And that really encouraged me to work in agriculture, primarily because of the people I met and the people I was working with. So, and my first job after finishing my doctorate was to work at the Soil Conservation Authority, and they were fantastic teachers in relation to soil condition and soil profile descriptions and managing the land for the future. So the Soil Conservation Authority had a big interest in no-till farming. So we're talking in the early 1980s, and they had a loan scheme. And when I got the job as a soil conservationist in Bendigo, part of my work was to develop and to demonstrate no-till farming with stubble retention using the new machinery to farmers in northwestern Victoria. And that's really where I developed my interest in working with farmers and farm groups, because of that introduction to that work through soil conservation. And I was very lucky in SoilCon that I had a lot of good mentors, and most of them have now passed on, but those mentors were so good in soils and describing a soil and describing the capability of a soil. And, we could dig a hole, and those guys would jump into that hole and tell you a whole story for half an hour or an hour about how the roots were developing and how the crops were growing and what was restricting the crop growth and root growth. And it was an amazing experience at that time. And that really introduced my interest in broadacre cropping, especially since at that time I also started working with farmers such as the Postlethwaites, who already in the early 1980s were no-till farmers, and Alan Postlethwaite had been over to the US, and primarily for him to learn more about the new machinery and what farmers were doing. And when he came back, I was working with him and his brother Roy in relation to crop production. And that's where my enthusiasm of working with farmers really started. So it was because those people were so enthusiastic about farming that it became addictive. And that's when I also became really interested in crop production. And so everything that I've learned and everything I'm going to talk about was taught me by farmers that I've worked with over the last 40 years. So there's nothing original in what I've done. I've just been working with great farmers, and they've taught me a lot about farming and what develops from there.
But Harm, talking to my father just in preparation for this, he told me that you would be humble in your commentary, and he speaks just so highly of the significant impact that you've had on the many hundreds of farming families that you've worked with, in particular across the Wimmera and the Mallee. And he speaks to the fact that you actually became quite indispensable as an independent and science-based advisor to them, which is to be acknowledged. I guess just to reflect a bit on some of the achievements that you've had, perhaps let's start with Farm Facts and then Farm 500, perhaps, on a significant project, I think back in the 80s. Would you mind speaking to those two projects?
Yeah, sure. So it would have been in the late 1980s, early 1990s that I met your dad, Tim Hutchings, and also Neil Clark through Farm Facts groups. And because they used to ask me to come and speak to their farm groups. And that was probably the first introduction I had. Well, it was definitely the first introduction I had to the power of farm groups as opposed to farmers working by themselves and learning by themselves. I mean, if you get 15 to 20 or whatever number were in the group of really interested and enthusiastic farmers together, there's an enormous amount of learning that takes place, not just for the individual farmers, but also us as consultants, because at that stage, I had left the department and became a private consultant. And it's really innovative to bring a group of farmers together and get them talking about their business. And we had a policy at that time, or your dad and Neil had a policy at that time, that whatever was discussed at the meeting stayed at the meeting. And farmers were willing to talk about their financials. As businessmen or business people, to actually open up with a group of other farmers who you can see as your competitors about your farm business is really, really amazing. But it also created a huge amount of camaraderie within the group so that people could trusted each other and people spoke from the heart about their business. And during the drought years, they could share their pain, and during their good years, they could share the financial, well, not the financial benefits, but the emotion that they had of having a really good year, which was obviously very profitable. And that is it's a really special thing to be part of that. So that particular group, Farm Facts, Neil had 2 groups in Victoria and your dad had 2 groups in southern New South Wales, then became Farm Management 500, where I think there was about 10 consultants like myself who were part of that, including Neil Clark and your dad, Tim. So I had 2 groups, one in Pyramid Hill in northern Victoria and one in Charlton, which is sort of in the centre. And Neil Clark was then running the Birchip FM 500 group. And essentially, that particular group then became the Birchip Cropping Group, who have thousands of members, and they get, well, in the early days, we had something like 1,500 farmers coming to our field days. So, and that really grew from those original Farm Facts groups. So it should not be underestimated what immense power and influence those early groups had.
I completely agree, Harm. This is probably about the time where you and I met. I was doing my thesis on benchmarking at Melbourne University, and through Tim and Phil O'Callaghan and Mike Stevens and Neil Clark, was lucky enough to do it on the FM 500 benchmarks. But I think it also coincided with a time where Neil and Tim and yourself were pioneering around bringing computers into the industry and bringing farm financial analysis into the industry as well. It was a really significant project, wasn't it? In preparation for this, I got Birchip Cropping Group to send me a bit of history, and they sent me the minutes from the 17th of November 1992 Farm Management 500 discussion group meeting for Birchip and Wimmera. And it was, I think, in that meeting where the idea for Birchip Cropping Group was born or agreed to be established. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that happened I think you're right. It was 1992. And that same year, the particular group, the FM 500 group that was based in Birchip, went to the Hart Field Day sites in South Australia, who established a year before that. And in the bus on the way home, farmers like Ian McClellan and John Ferrier and a lot of the others who were also in Farm Management 500 decided that they would create the Birchip Cropping Group as well. And so that was really how the Birchip Cropping Group was first set up, following a visit to the Hart Field Day sites in South Australia, based on the enthusiasm within the Farm Management 500 group.
What was the vision for Birchip Cropping Group then, from your perspective, Harm? What was the intention for it, and what was the outlook of those pioneering farmers who sought to establish it?
So ultimately, that falls back on Ian McClellan and also to John Ferrier. They are neighbours in terms of farming. Their outlook on farming is exactly the same, having a huge amount of enthusiasm and love for the farm, but the personalities are quite different. Ian is really based on enthusiasm and the big picture, and John is fantastic in the detail. So together they became a really powerful duo and set up the Birchip Cropping Group in 1993, as I said, following a visit to Hart, which was part of Farm Management 500, that visit.
If we jump forward 30 years, Harm, Birchip Cropping Group, I understand, employs now 20 people and has well over 400 members. How do you describe the impact that that grower group has had on Australian agriculture and certainly cropping in particular in Victoria?
It's a really long history, and it's sort of difficult to explain because things were quite different back then compared with how they are now. If farmers wanted to learn new practices 30 years ago, it really was through seeing what their neighbours were doing and working out together how that might improve their crop production systems. Whereas with that change in outlook of having shared information through a cropping group, that makes a big difference in terms of the outlook and your ability as a farmer to learn about new practices. And because I still remember in the early days, and so when we're in the early 1990s, we had 1,500 farmers or people come to a field day. Now, that is unheard of, to have that many people and all to look at, all the new crops the cropping group were growing, how they were being managed, fertiliser trials, herbicide trials, and we kept nothing a secret. I mean, everything that was done was discussed, and if it worked, well and good. If it didn't work, well, that's worth knowing too, because especially with herbicides and fungicides and insecticides. So, and I think that was really the basis of the success for the Birchip Cropping Group, as well as for Hart in South Australia, is that ability of farmers to learn from farmers rather than necessarily having agronomists and telling them what to do. And that was one of the major changes, I think, in the ability of farmers to learn. And the Birchip Cropping Group, their membership over the years hasn't really changed that much. It's still got that, roughly 500 members or something. But it's primarily the field days, not as well attended as they used to. They still get 600 odd people coming to the field day, but in the 1990s, there were 1,500 people that came to the field day. And there's now a lot of field days and a lot of competition. But the actual basis of the Birchip Cropping Group, of which is Ian McClellan's motto, is that the information is available to everyone and nothing is held back. And members and non-members, they do get the information and they all can come to the field days and learn about what's happening and how to improve crop production. But at the moment, because we've had so many good years in a row, it's quite easy to forget the really bad years. And during the millennium drought, things were really tough. I mean, you can't grow a crop on less than 100 millimeters of rainfall. And during that time, being part of a group like Birchip does give you support as a farmer. You can more easily talk to other farmers who are in the same position, and that helps as opposed to being home alone and seeing your paddocks blow away and not producing any crop. And I think we often look at the really good years as the examples of why a cropping group is successful, but I think the really bad years, with the support that a community has for each other, is actually really important as well.
Harm, would you mind speaking to the partnership or the bond between GRDC and CSIRO and Birchip Cropping Group and the importance of Birchip Cropping Group for those national organisations?
Well, the GRDC is the main funder of agricultural research in Australia. And as you know, all grain farmers contribute to the GRDC. And it'd probably be true to say that in the early days, the then GRDC was not as familiar with cropping groups as they are now, but it didn't take them long to start supporting projects put forward by the Birchip Cropping Group. And we've always had a really good relationship with the GRDC. And I hope that continues forever, because it's a natural progression is when you have large numbers of farmers. And I mean, you've got a group near Wagga as well, and the southern farming in the south of Victoria, and Hart is still going, and many other cropping groups. And they also have joint projects now and then as well. So the GRDC is a major supporter of the BCG, but so are many other contributors towards funding for the Birchip Cropping Group. And I think, Jeremy, you said 20 people. I think it might be actually 26 or 28 who now work in Birchip. So it is an amazing result. And Ian McClellan and John Ferrier have always said, we live here, we love our little town, and we love the community. And to have 25 or 26 people actually moving into a small town like Birchip, and actually most of them live there, is a huge change to the town itself. And young people. And a lot of marriages have eventuated. and Ian, quite honestly, always said that was one of his goals, to bring in new people into town, to grow the town and to grow the overall region in relation to people actually living in the Mallee.
Thank you, Harm. So, I mean, just more broadly, if we think across Australia now, there are many prominent and really significant grower groups. How important are they to the progress of farming in Australia?
Well, I'm pretty sure that they all have a very similar motto to what Birchip had. I'm not saying the same, but similar. And our motto was always without fear or favour. If we were doing herbicide trials or fungicide trials or fertiliser trials or whatever, and things didn't go as well as what was expected according to the product, what the product actually says, then that's not hidden from the farmers. So if we do a trial, then that becomes public information. And that's the way it should be, because that's when you learn, and the companies actually learn as well. Because, especially in the old days, I remember running the herbicide resistance trials. Well, actually, that's a really interesting story in itself, is that Anne and I went to Canada, and I think this was the late 90s, and the US, and we were meeting with farmers all over the place, and we also went to see Monsanto, and I had all the information with me about our trials, about herbicide resistance, and including glyphosate resistance in ryegrass. And when we went to see Monsanto in St. Louis, they absolutely said, that is really interesting, but it can't happen. And it can't be true. Where are we going for lunch? And that was our visit to Monsanto. We had a nice lunch with them, but they wouldn't accept that Roundup resistance could occur. And my feeling is, of course, they knew that, but they couldn't admit to that in the early days. And we had a whole field day set up at Roy Postlethwaite's place at that time on herbicide resistance in all the different groups, to all the different weeds and crops. And it was a huge success. Hundreds and hundreds of farmers turned up and looking at all the different trials and herbicide resistance. And we could openly talk with farmers about herbicide resistance, which was then a major, major issue. I mean, of course, it's still a big issue now, but we got different management practices now. But back then, we was 100% reliant on herbicides to control weeds. And mechanically, we did very little. And so it was a big deal. And it was a really good outcome following that visit because it just enthused us to actually do more on herbicide resistance and working with farmers to ensure that it was manageable. And so far, I'm not trying to downplay the problem that herbicide resistance is, but we're managing it reasonably well. We're still cropping after all these years, and that's the most important thing.
Harm, over your career, there have been a number of projects that you've pioneered. Maycheck being maximum economic yield check, CropFacts, the AppSim-based simulation modelling, yield profit, and the list goes on. Top Crop, I think, was an extension of Maycheck. Yeah. I'm going to throw to you, if I could, would you mind speaking to two or three of these, what they were and what they have achieved in helping us monitor and drive on-farm production?
Yeah, Jeremy, so the Maycheck program was the first one, maximum economic yield, like you said. And I was always interested in why things actually happen. I mean, I can't accept that something just happens. I've got to know why it happens. And if a crop doesn't grow, I want to know why it doesn't grow. And we had a thing called water use efficiency that was introduced by Reg French from South Australia in the 1990s or maybe even early or mid-1980s. And that was really the first time when Reg developed that, is where you could look at the amount of rainfall that a crop had and assess it in terms of its performance, in terms of yield. And there is a straight line relationship between rainfall and yield. And everyone knows that you need rain to produce a crop, but it's actually a very close correlation. So the Maycheck program looked at how well paddocks performed in terms of crop yield in relation to the amount of yield that was achieved for that particular year. So growing season rainfall from April to October, as well as stored soil water from summer rainfall in relation to yield. And then once you know that, then you can start looking at what were the limiting factors to that crop achieving that. So it could have been a heat wave in the middle of flowering, or it may have been not enough nitrogen. And back in those days, invariably, it was a lack of N. I mean, farmers were using urea, but if you compare the amount that was being used then to now, it's vastly different. So nutrition played a huge role, and farmers can actually address the lack of nutrition or insufficient nutrition, but they can't address the lack of rainfall unless you've got irrigation. So the Maycheck program, and I think we had something like 600 farmers part of that, who all received a report on their individual crop and where they fitted in relation to the water use efficiency achieved, and what were the management practices that led to either being highly water use efficiency or low water use efficient. And that was shared between not the names of people, but the information was shared with everyone. So that became, a really good tool to say, I grew 2.5 ton and these were the reasons why, rather than saying I grew a 10-bag crop, isn't that great? And a 10-bag crop is equivalent to 2.5 ton. So it was just a measure of farmers working together by sharing information collected on their farms and trying to work out what the limiting factors were. So that was the MyCheck program. And then towards a few years later, I met Peter Carberry and Svi Hockman from CSIRO, and they showed me the APSIM model, how that works. And so that's the simulation model. So the MyCheck program just looked at total amount of rainfall and yield achieved, and then with all the measurements done on farm in relation to soil type and nutrition and everything else. Whereas yield profit, or APSIM, the model, models the crop on a daily time basis. So using temperature, rainfall, nutrition, everything else, every day the model runs and it calculates how well the crop is growing. So it is hugely more accurate than a water use efficiency type program, which is a bucket. I've got a bucket of rainfall and I've got a silo full of grain, and how are those two related? APSIM is really looking at crop production on a daily time scale and then working out what are the limiting factors. Did you get a heat wave on a particular day? Or is the crop running out of nitrogen during the season because the model is saying the crop is using X amount of nitrogen and you've only got X minus 1, so you don't have enough and you need to put out nitrogen now if you want to keep growing that crop. So we started working with CSIRO, and that would have been one of the major changes for the Birchip Cropping Group to work with a world-renowned scientific organisation like CSIRO. There is a reason why there's no CSIRO in agriculture in Victoria, but that's a historical thing. And, they've always had offices all over New South Wales and Queensland and WA and South Australia. The Birchip Cropping Group started working with CSIRO, and they've made huge improvements in also the way that the Birchip Cropping Group do their work and report on their work, because CSIRO is a research organisation. They're scientific, and they made sure that the science that is done by the Birchip Cropping Group actually was good science. And it was fantastic to have those guys and women working with us, because they really brought in a whole new level of skills that we never had before.
Harm, is yield profit an extension of that project, and is it still accessible today, and are many farmers leaning on that technology?
So yield profit is available through the Birchip Cropping Group, and there are farmers who are using it, but it doesn't have the same impact anymore that it used to, and that's to be expected. This is 20 years old or something. And a lot of farmers have told me that they used yield profit for many years, consecutive years, and they've learned from it. But that's when the learning stopped, because nothing new was coming out. But it certainly helped them to actually produce crops much closer to potential than what they were doing previously. So it is still available. We've got a group of farmers that are dedicated yield profit users, and people want to have a look at it. Google yield profit, and profit is PROPH, so not FIT, so profit. And people do use it. And I actually still use it on a couple of my farmer friends on their paddocks, because I find it interesting to see how the crops are going, how much nitrogen is being used, when are they going to run out of water, and actually at the moment. I was using it just before because Birchip region is in the Decile 1 rainfall season, so it's bloody dry. Crop potential is 2 tonne if you look at the crop. But if you then look at yield profit, it's saying there is very little stored water left in the profile. So whether that average potential of 2 tonne can be achieved is probably, well, it's not just unlikely, it won't happen unless we have if we have more rain. And that rain has to be fairly soon because the crops are developing pretty fast. So that's how I use yield profit, and there is a group of farmers who is still using it for the same purpose.
Harm, what are a couple of the other sort of key projects that you see BCG having pioneered and achieved that are worth noting?
Well, there's a couple of things there, Jeremy. So on a yearly basis, they've got fungicide trials, insecticide trials and herbicide trials. I mean, that's ongoing, but obviously the chemistry is changing over as time goes on. I mean, there's herbicides now that we weren't using 10 years ago. But how to use them is still a really important thing for farmers to know because, I mean, herbicides is not just putting it out in the boom spray and hoping for the best. It's a lot correlated to the weather conditions at the time, the growth of the crop, the competition that the crop has, and all those type of things. So everyone knows herbicides don't all work the same ways. They all work in different modes of action, and therefore they need different conditions to optimize the use. So that kind of work is still going on. The nutrition work is still going on, especially with nitrogen use. And the group are still thriving in relation to the field day sites and the number of people that come to the field day sites. So there's a lot of information obviously out there, but actually to see it out in the paddock and comparing plots right next to each other with different treatments is a huge continuous learning exercise for not just farmers, but also for agronomists and anyone else interested in farming. It's not an easy thing to optimize water use efficiency, and to optimize water use efficiency is a huge step to maintaining profitability. So,
Harm, what sort of yield improvement have you seen? Let's say over the last 25 years, where were we and where are we now? And then what is your prediction? You know, if we think about the Mallee or, you know, the best producers in the Wimmera, what do you think is possible for us over the next 10?
Well, we're always limited by rainfall, and we all know that. And if you optimize water use efficiency, then you're using every millimetre of rainfall for crop production, you know, for crop growth, and hopefully then into yield, unless something catastrophic like a heat wave happens during flowering. Those sort of things happen and you can't manage for that. If it doesn't happen, then the way to remain profitable is to use as much water as you can by the crops. So, and essentially that is modelled through the APSIM as well, but you can still use the everyday normal Reg-French approach to working out, you know, the 20 kilograms per millimetre of rainfall per hectare. So 20 kilograms of grain per millimetre of rainfall per hectare should be your potential yield. And actually that 20 kilograms has improved a little bit over time because we got much better cultivars now than when Reg-French first developed that model. So there is an upper limit to what we can produce, but one of the other major changes that's happened in terms of profitability is the choice of crops that we have. I mean, we've grown canola for a long time, but certainly the early canola varieties are nothing like the new hybrids. You know, field peas have been grown as long as I have been around, but lentils haven't. And lentils are a fantastic, they're not a new crop anymore, but certainly relatively to field peas. Crops like lentils have have really changed farm profitability, especially for farmers with alkaline or neutral soils where lentils are really suited. And some of the new cultivars in lentils have been spectacular as well. So those things together will continue to be the challenges for the future, is to ensure that our crops have got the ability to use as much water as is available to them. And that is all based on cultivar selection as well as nutrition and making sure that diseases and weeds don't interfere in that. When you get that all together and you can work that out on how to do that, that will lead to successful farming for sure.
What excites you most for those farming families that you've supported, Harm?
Well, the first thing was that I'm now working, the people I worked with are either now the grandfathers or the fathers, or the fathers or the grandfather, and that the next generation and the generation after that is now on the farm. And what a huge success that is for those farming families to have, the kids and the grandkids now working on the farm as well. And the farms many of the farms are growing, not necessarily all of them, because, farms have different business structures and different models. And that is one of the things that excites me the most, is that farming is such a great business to be in. And let's face it, most farmers are really nice people. And there's always the exceptions, but I wouldn't, for the life of me, want to work in a high-rise in Melbourne with 500 lawyers in that building. I'd much rather work with a group of farmers who are generally open, happy to talk about their farm, communicate about the problems that they're having and the successes that they're having, rather than any other profession. I am extremely lucky to have worked with such a great group of farmers, and many are still extremely good friends. And I met a group of Moroccan farmers not a few months ago in Australia, and Anne and I are going there next week. Well, we're going to Europe first, and then we're going to catch up with those Moroccan farmers. And what a fantastic thing to do. We get to see Morocco, we get to learn how they farm. A couple of years ago, we were in Canada, in Argentina, talking with farmers about glyphosate during the period when, we were all worried that Roundup was going to be banned. And working with farmers is a great thing, because most farmers, if not all farmers, are really happy to talk about their farm and their farming community. And what a joy.
I think that tour that you mentioned might have been on the back of your 2020 GRDC Excellence Award, Harm. Congratulations.
I was trying to avoid that, Jeremy.
No, well done.
I just got an award from the GRDC. It's so pretentious to call it the Excellence Award.
How do you reflect on how progressed we are compared to some of the other countries that you've travelled to?
Well, we shouldn't underestimate the progress in other countries too. European farmers love farming as much as Australian farmers do. And of course, their farming system is completely different. And they don't own and crop thousands of acres. They crop hundreds of acres or hectares. And it's much smaller and very different. But they love farming as much as we do, as the farmers that you and I know. And they are as dedicated to making sure that the farm that they leave behind is the same as or better as the way they inherited from their fathers and mothers. So reflecting on farmers in other countries, it's always difficult, especially when you're in a continent where farmers receive such high subsidies for growing crops, but the high subsidies go together with commitments that Australian farmers wouldn't like restricting the use of particular practices that Australian farmers can do, but a European farmer can't do. But that's their life, and they're managing it, and they love farming as much as we do. And if you compare us farming to Argentina or Canada, it's much more similar. I mean, got huge farms, very big machinery, production is king, and second in line after that is looking after the land for the next generation and the community in general. And there's many innovative farmers out there, the same as in Australia, looking at better practices and how to do things in a different way to be sustainable and reliable income for the next generation.
Thanks, Harm. So just a couple of closing questions, if I could. What would you say to a farmer who's not part of a grower group in their area like Birchip Cropping Group?
We're all individuals, and some people really like being part of a group because, let's face it, farming can be a lonely business. I mean, there's only room essentially for yourself in the tractor, and you can't share it with a lot of other people in there. And they live generally a long way away from their neighbours or from the nearest town. So socially, it is very different to being in the city where you've got neighbours. I mean, I much prefer to be out in the countryside than in the city. But so farmers have more limits in relation to the people that they can be with and communicate with. And if there is a farming system group in your area with whom you can share your ideals about farming, your concerns about farming, and what you want to see farming looking like in the future, then I think farming system groups, because they're run by farmers, they're managed by farmers, a really good place, not only as a community hub, where you meet people, but also where you get new ideas. And we all need new ideas. I mean, the things that we were doing 30 years are now old hat, and young farmers are thriving at the moment. And a lot of new information is coming out and technology is changing rapidly. And if you can have a farming systems group in your area that can test a lot of the new processes and the new ideas, then you don't have to do it yourself, but you can learn together with the cropping group or the farm group. And Jeremy, that's no different to Farm Management 500 from 35 years ago. And it's exactly the same.
Harm, what would you say to the current team at Birchip Cropping Group by way of acknowledgement for the good work that they do and their dedication to that project?
So, Jeremy, I'm still on the Birchip Cropping Group Advisory Committee. So I do still go to the field days, and I am still part of the overall organisation in terms of setting directions for research. And the main thing about the cropping group, and it's always been like that since their inception, over 30 years ago, is that they are a group of really enthusiastic young people. And that enthusiasm hasn't changed over the last 30 years. I mean, the people have changed, but those young agronomists and people who work out in the field and sow all the trials and everything else, the level of enthusiasm they have for their job hasn't changed. And I think that is partly due to the respect that they get for the work that they do in the local community. I mean, there's no question that the farm groups contribute a lot more to the community rather than just trial results. I grew 3.8 tonne of wheat and you grew 4.8 tonne of wheat. And what's the difference? And the whole thing is to have that community component and people coming together to talk about the future, what worked and what didn't work.
Absolutely.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. What about the founders and I guess those pioneers 30 years ago? What would you say to them by way of acknowledging their enthusiasm and their dedication to getting Birchip Cropping Group off the ground?
Two of the original farmers, being E. McClellan and John Ferrier, are still on the board. And a lot of the other original farmers of the cropping group, not only board members, but also people in the locality and on whose properties we've had trials, are still there. And the success that they have created, not only by creating the BCG, which employ, I said before, 26 odd people who live in town, and that's a big deal in a tiny little town, but also in the amount of information that they've been able to gather over the years and the number of people that have been attracted to come to Birchip and the Southern Mallee in general, or the Mallee in general, from outside, like the CSIRO scientists and or from all over the place and from all over the world, has been life-changing for those communities because of the influx of new people and new blood, which is a fantastic thing. And I'll probably finish on this saying is that Ian McClellan had a saying of that he hates farming on his own. And he wants to share the successes and what he's doing on his farm. And now his son Tim has taken over and has got the same approach, which is such a fantastic thing.
Thank you, Harm. Harm, you mentioned the Millennium Drought a little while ago. I understand that you had to make some big decisions for you in that moment, and I think you went to New Guinea to lead a project over there for a few years. Would you mind speaking to that?
Yeah, so thank you, Jeremy. The Millennium Drought was a really difficult period, and it applied to everyone who's involved in farmers. I mean, not just the farmers. I mean, they wore the brunt of it, but all the other people that work with farmers and everything else were also affected. And I mean, there's not much as an agronomist what I could do to walk into a dying crop besides talking with the owner of that crop about managing that and not having an income from that, but still having the costs associated with it. And I mean, they were really difficult times. So Anne and I decided to go to Papua New Guinea for a period of time, and I became the head of agronomy in the oil palm industry. So widely different, oil palm to wheat, but at the same time, it's still a plant and it's got the same needs. And Anne and I worked there for 3 years. And I know it was in a lot of ways devastating that I left the Birchip Cropping Group. Many people certainly weren't happy, but they still gave us a fantastic farewell and we had a really good time. And of course, they are still good friends of ours, but it was a really difficult time. But working on oil palm provided a whole other outlook, and living in a third world country, a whole other outlook on issues related to farming. And, farming in Papua New Guinea is very small scale. The oil palm industry is huge, but for individual oil palm farmers, it's very small scale and very hard work, but it provides a huge amount of employment and income to the country. So, I appreciate there are a lot of environmental issues with oil palm, but as a first world country to say to a third world country, no, you can't do that. We've done that in the past, but you can't do it now, to me is extremely hypocritical. And I think oil palm, when it's managed well, can be a huge benefit to third world countries. And we all use the oil palm on a daily basis in so many products that we use. So that was a difficult time for us to leave. And when we came back, my work certainly changed, but I'm still working actively with the Birchip Cropping Group. I'm on the research committee. My friends are still my friends. Their kids I know, but consulting definitely changed after that time.
Harm, can I just in wrapping up, acknowledge the significant impact that you've had on so many farming families, but the role that you've played and the dedication you've shown as an independent agronomist, bringing science-based communication and best practice production and farm management systems to farming families across Australia. It's an amazing career. We've only just touched on it lightly, but I know I speak for my father and all the people you've touched over your career when I say it's been a significant contribution. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. I mean, those compliments always make me feel very uneasy because we had such a good time working with all these people. I mean, we've had a dream career. Anne was working. I talk about all the work. My partner, Anne, she actually does all the work. So she was sowing all the Birchip Cropping Group trials in the early days on open seeders, and which were only a couple of feet wide and all those sort of things. And she had a harvester which was completely open. And we were both so lucky to be working in farming. And I thank all the farmers that I've worked with and all the farmers in Australia. It's a fantastic industry to work in. And all the advisors, of course.
One final question. What would your one piece of advice be to a progressive young farmer of today?
Well, really understand how your crop grows, what is limiting its production, so that you can actually ensure that you grow a highly water use efficient crop, but always work on your financials. Because ultimately you may grow a 4-ton crop, but if you don't make a profit out of it because your input costs have gone through the roof, then that is not going to be sustainable in the future. So try to work on understanding how your crop grows, how it performs, and never lose sight of your financials.
Great to connect again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Jeremy. Talk to you next time.
Bye for now.
And there you have it, team. A wonderful conversation with an incredible contributor to the production of Australian farmers. I think Birchip Cropping Group does stand out for me as the pinnacle farming systems group or grower group in Australia. I want to congratulate Fiona Best, the CEO to that project, and her team of 26 for the great work they do day in, day out, in season, making sure that we're right on top of all that we're doing in this complex game of crop and pasture production that we play. I think equally important for Birchip Cropping Group, and as Harm so beautifully described, is the importance of that project, not just for its local town, but for the broader community that supports it and is involved with it. Farming can be a lonely place, and what's so important is that we come together to learn together, to share ideas, and to pursue excellence in a group. And for me, there's not a better and more proactive and progressive group of farmers linked directly with corporate suppliers and our major researching institutes than Birchip Cropping Group. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Harm just as much as I did. And again, my thanks and congratulations to Fiona Best, to Ian McClellan, to John Ferrier, and the whole Birchip Cropping Group team. Thanks, everyone. Take care. All the best as this season now really unfolds for us, and look forward to connecting again soon. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Profitable Farmer podcast by Farm Owners Academy. If you're new to this show, be sure to follow us. If you've been a long-time listener, let your friends know about us, or come continue the conversation in the Profitable Farmer Facebook group. All the best as you grow your business and create your freedom farm. Until next time, keep being incredible.